Now, we have a guest on today. And this is a guest who I've come to know since I sort of debuted in the world. And in fact, this guest happens to be the person that actually debuted me to the world, that brought me into the world. His name is Tim Ferriss. And in September of 2015, he interviewed me on his podcast just prior to the release of my book, Extreme Ownership. Now, at the time, I was certainly a Tim Ferriss listener. I'd read The 4-Hour Workweek. I'd listened to a bunch of his podcasts, but I hadn't listened to all of them. And I think I had kind of the broad view that most people have of Tim. The human guinea pig, the investor, the author, just, Mr. Smart, successful, healthy guy who's out there enjoying the fruits of life. And with all that stuff in my mind, there I was in the first ever interview I had ever actually done with anybody ever. And it's a setup. The setup is, it's an interesting setup going into this for me, right? We're alone. I don't know Tim. I'm not the most open person in the first place. I don't know Tim. We meet 2 hours before. Now we're in his house alone at a table. And the interview starts going kind of Jocko-ish pretty quickly. And I start going a little bit heavy on some stuff. And at one point, Tim asked me about books that I've read. And I brought up About Face. And then I brought up Cormac McCarthy, Blood Meridian. And I described how I liked that book because it captured the darkness. And not just the darkness of the world, but the dark nature of human beings in the world. And Tim, after I described that darkness, he said something along the lines of, like, hey, Jocko, I struggle with this. How much should I voluntarily expose myself to darkness? Because I've had my own ups and downs that I contend with. And then he kind of took that question from there and from that personal level, and he really quickly transferred it into something that was more about the world and about humanity in general. But the initial question that Tim started to ask, it wasn't about the world. And it wasn't about humanity in general. The question that Tim was asking was about Tim. And I didn't catch that during the interview. It went right over my head. But when I listened to the interview, I caught it. And I heard it. And I heard that beneath this guy that we all see, this happy-go-lucky exterior, kind of a solid image of mental and physical and spiritual strength, there was some darkness in there. And Tim and I were going back and forth a few weeks ago, and he said something to me, I'm not sure if I'm aligned with the types of guests you normally have on your podcast. And thinking back instantly to that moment, I said, oh no, Tim, you definitely are. Because you are a person. You're a human. And this is a podcast about human nature. And despite all the success you've had some challenges in your life. You've had some dark times, and you still do, and we all do. And people ask me about suicide. I mean, most of the time it's some indirect messaging or some messaging through Facebook, but people will ask me about suicide, whether they're having those thoughts, and I haven't really addressed it directly. because even though it's suicide has definitely impacted my life directly in some awful and horrible ways that I'll never forget. But I don't have that same level of knowledge. So today we do have that level of knowledge. And we're going to dive into it. So without further ado, Mr. Tim Ferriss, welcome to the show, and thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.